in synthesising evidence and talking with them about how it might relate to policy and practice within Australia. And the third thing we do, which is the largest component of our work and underwritten largely by corporate philanthropy and other donors, is translational research. So that's about how do we get best evidence into policy and practice and programs within Australia. And I'll talk a little bit about the sort of programs that we're working on. And there are guiding principles that sort of define our work. Just some recent achievements, and I'll just make sure that this little thing, it does. So in 2008, we undertook one of the first report cards on child and youth wellbeing comparative to other developed countries, which showed us sort of in the middle at best when it comes to child and youth wellbeing, which is surprising to a lot of people. There's been subsequent reports, particularly from Save the Children and UNICEF, which actually puts us lower, in the lower half of OECD countries. You might find that all pretty surprising. We did. Ours has actually been the most optimistic international comparative report card. So I think we've got a fair way to go. Another big project that we're working on is a COAG FAXIA-funded project that's really looking to prevent child abuse and neglect by broadening the role of practitioners working with vulnerable families on the ground to better identify needs and strengths in families so that we can better help themselves to reduce the incidence of abuse and neglect. And this is really about changing that deficit model that I know you talked about a bit earlier to a strengths-based model. And we're doing that through working through 20 pilot sites across a range of professions to progress the rollout of that particular model. And it's being rolled out in preschools, in community health centres, in GP surgeries, a wide range of professionals who previously to this have been working on their own little, a child health nurse goes into the home, works on immunisation, walks out, doesn't actually acknowledge that there might be a drug and alcohol or other sort of problem in the home that we know are implicated with child abuse and neglect. We're also spent quite a bit of time on the middle years agenda because that's a policy and program vacuum, we think. It is slowly developing. We're really pleased to see a lot of work and a lot of effort by government very recently in acknowledging social and emotional learning and resilience as a really important factor. So we're really pleased to see that agenda going. And of course, we did have a strong role in, and continue to, in early childhood. What we've got in line for this year and next year is a sustained nurse home visiting efficacy trial. Now, when you look at the evidence on what works best to prepare children's readiness to learn before they enter school, this program has the strongest evidence. So children born into poverty and vulnerability, when you look at what works, programs such as a really intensive nurse home visiting the child's the family home every 2 weeks for 2 years, has the strongest evidence for educational attainment for kids and parental engagement and involvement. How many RCTs do we have in Australia demonstrating its impact? One tiny one. They've got 30 years of research in America and North America on this program. So what we're doing is using the best evidence from overseas to translate that to what it means for Australia and delivering an RCT large-scale trial, looking at about $4 million over 4 years for that trial, which will develop an open model, an open source model for other state governments to use. We're also working on a national social marketing campaign with government and partnership with South Australia, and there's actually a presentation on that next that I hope you can attend over in this room, I hope. And we've also got a conference on implementation. We believe that a lot of programs fail, not because of bad programs, but because they're not implemented properly. And what's the science behind implementing programs, practices and policies at a local level? We think that this is totally underplayed in Australia. This follows a conference that I attended last year in International Global Implementation Conference. We're running this with the Parenting Research Centre this year, and this is going to be around best practice for implementing. And we're also developing a national action plan for child and youth wellbeing. A lot of brilliant agendas currently in Australia: early childhood, development, reform agendas, the youth agendas. This is about bridging those gaps, bringing them together in a cohesive vision, because if we want to get to a place of collective action, we've got to have a cohesive vision, and this is really what the NEST is all about. So if you want to know more about that, just go to the nestproject.org I don't think it's .au, is it? No, I think it's just .org, and see how you can contribute to that. On that note, can I hand it over to my colleague Josh, and I'll be speaking a little bit later.
Thanks, Lance. Look, one of the key objectives for our research for the Bureau was to examine the notion that that the home accounts for 60 to 80% of student achievement, while the school accounts for 20 to 40%. And it took us a while to get to the bottom of this. It's a notion that's apparently bandied about a bit, but it's not actually in any of the literature on parental engagement per se. So took a bit of hunting around, and I think where it has emerged from is this peculiar field called school effectiveness research, which began with the Coleman report in the US in 1966, which analysed data from 4,000 schools and found that between 5 and 35% of variance in individual achievement was due to between school factors such as facilities, curriculum, the overall quality of teaching, once the socioeconomic background of students had been taken into account. And in the UK, the following year, there was another report, the Plowden report, which concluded that differences between parents explain more of the variation in children than differences between schools. And since that time, many studies have confirmed those findings, specifically that family background and characteristics are more important than schools in determining academic outcomes. And there are a wide variety of statistical methods used to come to the figures, and there are literally hundreds of reports and studies in this area, but they tend to come out between the 8 to 15% range. And so that's where we think this notion arose. But it's important to bear in mind that just asserting that the school accounts for a small proportion of the variation in achievement doesn't necessarily imply that home accounts for the rest of it. And here's a couple of reasons, some of which are rather technical and others which are pretty intuitive. Some of the studies in school effectiveness research examine factors at the whole of school level, while others concentrate on factors within the school. So there's different units of analysis. And so the definition of school is not consistent in this field. And Australian research has actually shown that the magnitude of school effects can vary widely between 0% and 18% depending on the unit of analysis that's used. So between 0%, as in it makes no difference, to 18%. So that's one problem with dividing up the home and the school in this kind of way. Another problem is that we're not necessarily talking about things that can be changed. You can't change things like genetic predisposition, family background, social status or location, but you can hope to change things like the material resources available for learning and the level and extent of level and type of parental engagement. And so there's one researcher has commented that to assume that we can interpret a variable, that is the non-school, in terms of what it's not, would be unwise. So that should be enough to realise that this field is the topic of a lot of academic debate, some of which is highly abstruse, but nonetheless, school effectiveness research is often used in policy debates because it purports to provide a single quantitative measure of the effectiveness or otherwise of schools, even though the story is much more complicated than that, and I'll try and explain that a little bit more. So part of the confusion, I think, arises from two very different ways of thinking about the homeschool breakdown. The first is the relative influence of home versus school. And that's the breakdown that I suspect is often used in policy discussion. The second breakdown, which is more relevant for policy in this area, is the relative influence of on learning of parental activities that take place in the home versus parental activities that take place in the school. And I'll just quote from some of the research about this, that from the US, from the Harvard Family Research Project, it's all but impossible to separate the interests and influences of educators, parents and other educational partners on student achievement, attitudes and behaviours. Although it's harder to study more than one setting at a time, it's critical for researchers to recognise the simultaneous and cumulative effects of home, school and community on student development. So, although there's a great deal of research out there, I'm sure some of which you've encountered in the last couple of days on the importance of parental engagement of various kinds, there's no definitive measure of the relative importance of home and school-based engagement from, at least from our investigations. There are some other definite issues that make it hard to compare home and school. So for research purposes, parental involvement might be limited to activities that take place in the school, or it could be much broader and probably more realistic, incorporating parenting behaviours at home, and also importantly attitudes towards schooling and so forth. There's a huge variety of research methods that have been used, different indicators to measure success. There's a lot of disagreement about the extent to which a direct causal relationship between parental engagement and academic outcomes can be identified, although there is certainly an indirect link. There is a great deal of evidence, though, that shows that parents' attitudes, behaviours and actions have a substantial impact on learning and attainment. And if I needed to summarise what that evidence says in a sentence, I'd say it's the active participation of parents in learning, especially in the home, that has the greatest impact on outcomes. And here are some examples of what the evidence says about the kinds of outcomes that parental engagement can improve: higher grades and test scores, enrolment in high-level programs and advanced classes, higher successful completion of classes, lower dropout rates, higher graduation rates, and a greater likelihood of commencing post-secondary education. But importantly, we should also look at non-academic outcomes, and the evidence says that parental engagement of the right kind can lead to more regular attendance, better social skills, improved behaviour, better adaptation to school, increased social capital, a greater sense of personal competence and efficacy for learning, greater engagement in schoolwork and a stronger belief in the importance of education. Because of the wide range of literature in the area, there are some other perspectives that are worth noting. For example, some research from an economic perspective has shown that parental effort, that is the combination of all the types of involvement that that parents can have, including involvement that takes place in the school as well as the home, has a large effect on achievement compared with school resources, that is per pupil spending on teaching. And the magnitude of that effect is equivalent to an extra 4 to 6 years of parental education, or more than $1,000 in per pupil spending. It's probably also worth noting that some of the criticism of how parental engagement is defined, and particularly parents from different cultural backgrounds, it's been suggested that policies and programs don't necessarily take into account the activities which parents, some of the activities that parents initiate outside the school system, such as limiting the amount of TV watching time, being home when children get back from school, taking children to cultural events and going to their sporting events. So we've come up with a model for affecting change that is based on some research from the Harvard Family Research Project, a 2-year study across 129 schools. And this model was originally used to explain the various causal relationships between different variables, but it's a really nice way of thinking about where we can hope to affect change. We've adapted the model slightly to simplify the language and to place parental engagement in a broader ecological context that takes into account the range of influences on learning and development. And it shows how parental engagement takes place in a dynamic system which can be influenced by intervention at various points, and in particular those points that are highlighted in bold in our diagram. That is family practices and behaviours, student factors and the school community. And the research underpinning this particular research, large-scale research, showed that it's the following practices which have the greatest influence on learning outcomes. Schools clearly articulating their expectations of parents and regularly communicating with them. Schools providing parent education so that parents know how to help their child meet learning standards in the curriculum. Ongoing conversations between parents and teachers about the respective roles of each, and schools providing a range of different types of opportunities to talk with school personnel. So as I've alluded to, the body of literature in this area is quite vast and covers a wide range of issues and perspectives, and that makes it really hard to provide a comprehensive picture of the evidence. But there were 2 principles which kept emerging as we went through the literature. Different authors used different terminology, and so it took us a while to understand that they were often essentially talking about the same things. The first concept is academic socialisation. The second is, appropriate parental role construction. And we've added a third principle because we think it balances the first 2, and that's a focus on student wellbeing. So, academic socialisation, this is a term used by some researchers by the names of Hill and Tyson, and they explain that academic socialisation is part of, but not the same as, home-based involvement. And I think it's probably worth just breaking this down into a few areas to give you a sense of what they're talking about. So, in the area of communication, school-based involvement might be communication between parents and school personnel. Home-based involvement might be communication between parents and children about school. But if we take an academic socialisation perspective, it's communication between parents and children about parents' expectations for education and about the value and enjoyment of learning. School-based involvement might mean visiting school for events and so forth. Home-based involvement might mean helping with schoolwork, but if it's academic socialisation, it's discussing learning strategies with children. If we're talking about school, there's probably limited opportunities for parents to become involved in academic and learning opportunities in the school. Home-based involvement means creating an environment at home which is conducive to learning, and academic socialisation involves linking schoolwork to current events. And if we talk about how people parent, school-based involvement might mean building relationships with teachers. Home-based involvement might mean taking children to the kinds of events that foster learning. But academic socialisation means fostering educational aspirations and making preparations and plans for the future. So we think academic socialisation is important because it can be applied across the age spectrum. It doesn't rely on parents taking part in school-based activities, which the evidence shows is most appropriate for primary school age children. And parents don't need to understand the academic content to do this kind of thing well. It applies equally well to high school students as to primary school students. There's no definitive age, of course, at which parents cease to make a difference to achievement, but they'll be doing different things over the course of the school years. So the next principle for effective engagement is parental role construction. And this is about the fact that parents' ideas about appropriate roles and behaviours in relation to education are affected by multiple interacting beliefs and norms, and the extent to which they become engaged and sustain that engagement over time is affected by how they perceive themselves as an actor in their child's education. Research shows that the way parents perceive their role in education is generally determined by these factors: beliefs about appropriate and desirable child outcomes, beliefs about who's responsible for those outcomes, perceptions of what important group members expect from them as parents, so group members as in family, teachers, other parents, and parental behaviours associated with those beliefs and expectations, and of course the distinctive characteristics of individual children and individual parents play a big part. Once parents make the decision to participate, they choose specific activities shaped by their perception of their own skills and abilities, as well as other demands on their time. And it's easy to see how parental role construction is an important concept for policies that target different cultural and language groups and other hard-to-reach parents. And there are several barriers to getting the right kinds of parental role construction. Parental engagement is lowest when role construction is weak, when parents don't believe they should be involved in their child's education or don't think that their involvement makes a difference. If a parent's had a negative experience of education in the past, they might feel intimidated by the education system and the school environment. And in some cultural contexts, there are specific beliefs about the proper roles of parents and teachers, and a firmer view about the proper delineation between the two. And that'll in turn influence the extent to which parents become engaged. So these two principles, academic socialisation and parental role construction, we believe need to be tempered by an acknowledgement that academic outcomes aren't the whole story. There are a range of other intermediate outcomes which will in turn influence academic outcomes but are important in and of themselves. So for example, motivation for learning. There's some research out there which explains the difference between intrinsic motivation for learning and extrinsic. And it's intrinsic motivation for learning that we want to encourage, so the desire to learn for its own sake. But unfortunately, there are other kinds of motivation, extrinsic motivation, that relate to parents that could include the desire to please family, a perception of an obligation to repay family by achieving academically, perceptions of strong family support for academic achievement, which is certainly a positive thing, a desire to avoid emulating negative family role models is an extrinsic motivation for learning, and a perception that family exerts little or no influence on academic motivation and performance. And student motivation is an important factor which could be a key indicator for the success of parental engagement programs. So we're going to discuss that, or Lance will cover that in a bit. as we were going through the literature, it became pretty clear that there are some fundamental challenges in determining what kinds of parental engagement are working or not working. The first is defining what parental engagement consists of in the context of a given program. In terms of tracking how a program is going, engagement could be limited to activities that take place in the school, which are pretty easy to track, or it could be much broader and incorporate parenting behaviours at home and also attitudes, but which are harder to measure. A second challenge is variation in what schools do to promote engagement on the ground. So because engagement programs, appropriately enough, are often based on the needs and preferences of parents, what happens on the ground can vary widely, and that means that you can't necessarily compare these activities directly, and success might be highly context dependent and even dependent on individual personnel. Another evaluation challenge is the multiple and intersecting arenas in which learning and development occurs. As well as the inability or the difficulty in ascribing causality between parental engagement activity and better outcomes. Evaluating through experimental or quasi-experimental designs, which would provide this kind of evidence, is both expensive and perhaps problematic from an ethical perspective. As I said before, there's an indirect link between parental activity and academic outcomes, even though academic outcomes are the most easily measured kind of outcomes. And the program or funding context through which parental engagement activity is funded. So under the Commonwealth funded national partnerships in Australia, parental engagement is one of several areas which receives policy and funding support. Just like in the United States, the No Child Left Behind Act specifies parental engagement as a key area of activity, along with many, many other areas. So when you're evaluating an initiative as a whole, like the No Child Left Behind Act, it's difficult to isolate the effects of parental engagement per se from other activities that are funded under the program. So because of all those challenges, we think that there's a case for developing a series of indicators that would provide us with an indication of whether parental engagement activity is working and in what respects and where the gaps are. So I'll hand over to Lance now.
Thanks for that, Josh. So there's a whole bunch of evidence that's actually quite difficult to get a handle on, as you can see. And we've tried, we think the Harvard model is a good model. We do think it needs to be enhanced with the more ecological view of child wellbeing. And you can see that we've attempted to do that in the model that Josh put up previously. But I think the other thing is, in terms of applying this knowledge, we strongly believe that a systems-based lens is going to be particularly useful in trying to apply this, because after all, if we're just going to apply bits of it to bits of the system, it's only going to have a minimal impact. And we think there's an opportunity to look across the system to impact on parental engagement. Now, when we look at a system itself, they're made up of four components that we look at least within RACI, on what impacts on the system. System norms. So what are the underlying values and guiding principles that kind of determine where we're at? And are there ways of structuring those values and social norms? So how do parents perceive their role in child's education? How do teachers see their role how do teachers see parents' role in the children's education? And I think that in itself is a really interesting starting point for looking at how we can influence the system. The resources, do we have the skills and capacity to actually improve parental engagement at a school, at a community-based level? Do we have the stakeholders coming along with us? Do we have resource to actually influence that change? We've heard what's happening in Canada, for example, And when we started looking at the huge amount of work that's happening in America, it's evident that there's a lot of economic resources going into other countries. What about regulations? Are there regulations within the system that are helping in parental engagement within Australia? And I'll talk about that in a second. And how are decisions made? Are we using best evidence and data to inform development of parental engagement policies and practices? I just want to focus on a few of these things, particularly around, because we don't have time, particularly around system norms and around regulations and power making. The resources I'll leave to the experts who allocate resources and so on, but I just want to talk very briefly about two of these areas. One of them is around system norms and this issue that Josh raised earlier. What is success in education? Does it mean that you're actually getting, the top grades in your school? And how does that influence parents' view of their role in prompting and engaging with children's education? Are home and school seen as two separate learning domains? Well, I leave all the teaching up to the teacher. I don't do anything at home. And what is the evidence on parents' perception on their own role? And Josh talked a little bit about this role issue that definitely is out there. And what's parents' perceptions of themselves as teachers within the home? One of the things I just wanted to show you was some research that we're working on actually for a project that I mentioned earlier, that's Workshop 8, the National Social Marketing Campaign anyway, I won't talk any more about that. But we're working with a social research partner who's looking at some issues around parental perceptions of reading with children and also parental perceptions of counting with children. So this was a fairly extensive bit of research, 1,000-person survey with focus groups and then a whole range of individual interviews. And this is a summary of the findings. Look, and it sort of shows that reading, parents kind of know it's important and do it and they love doing it. And it's kind of, my child read by the age of 2 months. Isn't that fantastic? My child's better than yours, kind of thing. So it is seen as a sort of reward, not a rewarder. And so, but I think one of the key things that came out is there's less compliance with this behaviour with the age of the child. So the older the kid gets, and this wouldn't be news to any of you, the older the kid gets, the less the parent reads. Now with counting with children, when it comes to maths literacy, numeracy, parents, there was a really interesting other slide I could put up around parental understanding that the kids are born to kind of count with numeracy. They don't believe that. They think that's absolute garbage. In fact, there was major kickback on that. There's pretty low compliance with any sort of counting and maths the older the age of the child too. And this is less compliant behaviour. I know I'm sounding like a social engineer, but less compliant behaviour in this area than there is in reading. So there is a perception that the parents, at least in this bit of research, I know there's a huge amount of research in this area, but we thought this is interesting as far as children's parents' values and perception of their role is concerned, that there is an issue there. Parents kind of see their role as reading with kids, doing a bit of counting, that's all I need to do, off you go to school. And I think that is a real problem in future reforms if we're really going to be fair income about parental engagement in the future. I won't go into that because that's Workshop 8. So I do think, if teachers are expecting, if teachers are expecting parents to engage in child's education at home and parents don't see their role as that, then we've got a problem in the system. And I think that's one thing we really need to address. There are some plans underway to start to address that in a population sense, and we're hoping that's a good starting point in the system. The other thing is systems, norms and regulations. I just wanted to, we did in the report start to map all of the effort, and it's just amazing what's happening in Australia. It is brilliant. It's kind of hard to get a handle on it, and I know don't point out what's missing and don't point out the typos in there yet. This is just a draft, but this is just trying to kind of highlight some of the effort that's happening. So there is a huge amount of work happening. I guess the question that we had is that there is a lot of effort. Is it aligned and properly resourced, is our question. There is a huge amount of evidence, as Josh pointed out, that this does warrant significant resourcing and enhancement of the agenda. And the resourcing argument is that positive child wellbeing outcomes are attained through parental engagement. There is unequivocal evidence that you do get educational outcomes as a result of parental engagement. How much is up for debate, but you do get it. That leads to educational attainment, which leads to productivity outcomes. Now, the country that's done this best is actually Canada. Canada and the Scandinavian countries will do well, don't they? And they've actually quantified this, the outcomes of parental engagement, as Josh started to talk about earlier. But I think we could be doing better. And what about some legislation to underpin what we're doing in Australia? Some strong legislation that underpins and resources parental engagement better than we've done. And I think we need to point to the best practice in the world, and one of the world's best legislators, of course, is George W. Bush. And he, showing his empathy with children here. And
we know how the baby feels.
you know how the baby feels. He did, and here he is teaching kids to read upside down. So, but George Bush did two good things in his career. The first was to leave politics. The second was actually the No Child Left Behind Act. And I assume you've all heard of this, and particularly Section 1118, which actually is a bit of legislation that mandates states and schools to do parental engagement. It's part of the law over there. You know, the land of the free and let everyone prosper economically at the expense of others. Here they have embedded in law the need for parental engagement in schools. And does it work? Well, unfortunately, we couldn't find any strong, maybe you're able to tell us from a Canadian perspective if there's any evaluation of it. It seems to be working pretty well. Definitely when you start looking at what resources are available out there, this is where all the effort's at. So they are required to develop involvement policies. They are required to develop compact. They've got these resources, similar to the resource centres that you identified. That's all backed by legislation and a bit of money. Yes, there is the interim, at least the evaluations that we saw, showing that maybe there's not enough money in there, insufficient training, but I think this does really warrant a really close examination in the Australian context if we're going to get fair income about improvements to parental engagement. What about once we've got an ideal system, assuming we can get an ideal system and align values and efforts and so on, what about some accountability and measures? And I think one of the things that Josh mentioned earlier is that we think there's a strong case for looking at what would be indicators of success for ideal parental engagement. And there hasn't been a lot of work done in this area. And we strongly believe that if you want to improve something, you've got to measure it. How do you measure parental engagement? And and I apologise for this is the model that was up earlier. What we've done is suggested a range of indicators that could measure success in these particular areas. And we think success can be measured, for example, in family practices. We know that these, based on the evidence that we've come across, these do have expectations, have a major impact on as a major engagement indicator, but also educational attainment indicator. And these can be example measures. And of course, there's a range of existing validated instruments that can help measure this. This isn't going to take a lot of resourcing. There's some brilliant longitudinal series data that government already fund. You know, the LSAC, Longitudinal Studies of Australian Children, the LSIC, which is the Indigenous children, the home scale and so on. These are all available within Australia. What we could be doing is collating them to get some comparative indicators of success just on this family practices domain. But let's look at the other domains. Student factors, we can also measure that. You know, there's ways of doing that through example measures, level of confidence, proportion of students report being... A lot of these can be and are being collected. We should be collating them in a comprehensive framework so that we can start to bring some accountability and some measures into the system that will allow what you're doing at the local level to better articulate the impact that you may be having. Similarly with community relations, which we didn't think there were many measures of, but we came across a whole bunch of them. And there are, again, there's a... I think you actually mentioned one of the surveys that you use in Canada here. These measures are available. They can just be rolled out. I mean, that takes some resourcing, but we think this is a really good starting point for affecting change. So, finally, just moving forward, I think we have enough evidence that on the what. We probably need a bit more research to fill in the gaps. I think the big gap is in the how. How do we actually get this into practice? And how do we get that into practice and policy in a systematic way, in a scalable way, is the key challenge, I think. We do need, I think, a systems-based analysis on this issue is really required. We need to map the boundaries of existing efforts, and there's a lot of existing brilliant effort at the moment. Where does it sit, and what is the evidence saying? We need to look at what's happening at the grassroots level. I know there's some research underway to start to collate that. It's really good to see. I think that's a good starting point, but also looking at overseas models. And importantly, is there a way of systematising effort? Can we look at a Section 1118 for Australia? Should we be looking at legislation to underpin this? What's the resourcing requirements? Is there a sticks or carrots approach that we can that should be there for schools, for communities, to see this area enhanced? And I guess importantly, how do we ensure ongoing accountability and progress? Well, as we've said, we strongly encourage an indicator development framework that can start, I guess, enabling a better narrative around what works in parental engagement. So thank you very much for your time. There's another advert. I do hope to see you at our implementation conference in, I'm sorry, Kaz. Thank you very much.
Very happy to leave the advert up, Lance. Look, thank you both. Thank you both. The Bureau and the Research Advisory Group attached to the Bureau is really excited about the way that you've brought it from the 45 years of evidence to the so what, and then on to, in fact, areas that we can pursue. I just want to take 1 second to say when Anne Bliss and Dr. Jan Patterson spoke yesterday, they made the point that all of the key reform agenda pillars have been really well funded. Favourite quotes, AITSL gets 5.6 billion, ACARA gets 9 billion. The one single pillar that has not been funded is the pillar of parent engagement and linking it to student wellbeing. We believe that that's fundamentally the direction to go. The present funding for that, for the project led by Jan Patterson and for the Bureau, 1.4 million over 5 years versus 8 billion. The good news is that we do understand that there is synergy now, and we will have the capacity to work forward the how. So there will be more work, I'm sure, for ARACE to do on our behalf, and there's definitely synergies between what you're doing in other areas and our policy interests. A big question around the legislation, I think Elaine made the point too, that it's actually legislation that has enabled this to become a serious focus. And that is a major question here in Australia, is that the key lever surrounded by strategy and policy that we need to just take those extra steps forward. So Jacqueline just wants to point out morning tea requirements. Gentlemen, we have gifts for you. Shall I? And thank you very much.
They both clearly need one. Just a joke. It's Saturday morning. Come on. I just want to let you all know that the presentations that are being made throughout the symposium will be made available on the Bureau website. So for all of those of you furiously taking notes, do not fear. We've also had several requests for a participants' contact list for the symposium. So afterwards I'll send an email out to all of you and I will give you an opt-out option. So if you don't want your details shared with the group, then I'll give you about a week to let me know, and then we'll produce a participants list so you can continue your great networking and contacts that you've made. I've received lots of feedback yesterday and last night that people are happy with how things are going and that you're enjoying it. And I would just like to acknowledge two people in particular who have been working furiously behind the scenes, and we couldn't have been here without them. Alex Benham and Melissa Eagles from DEWA, who've been responsible for everything behind the scenes, and I really appreciate all your help and all your work. So thank you, and I've got a little gift for you too. So morning tea, thank you very much. So we're here to look at the crucial role that the principal plays in fostering parental engagement both in school and in the home. And we heard this morning from Lance and Josh about the percentage difference, you know, that in school versus out of school or the parental stuff can make. And we don't ever want that to undermine or be competing with, you know, the statistics of what happens in school, because